Hello and welcome to the Majlis, Ready for European Liberties Current Affairs podcast focusing on Central Asia. I am Mohammed Tahir, the host of the Majlis podcast and Ready for European Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. Today, which is July 2nd, in Kyrgyzstan's Jalalabad region, a man gets freed from detention despite he was found guilty for torturing his wife and despite the whole thing was captured on camera. There are strange reasoning behind what happened and why it happened. We will get into that a little bit later. But this is one of many such examples of cruelty against women that Central Asian society has become accustomed to seeing repeatedly. And such abuses are skyrocketed during the COVID-19 lockdown. So we are here to discuss what's the source of this problem. Is there anything can be done about it? And what kind of resources available for victims of domestic violence in the region? And as we have guests from 3 of 5 Central Asian countries along the way, we will also compare notes with situation in our neighboring countries. So to discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Khalida Ajigulova, the director of the Research Center for Human Rights, Inclusion and Civil Society. Also, Khalida is an associate professor at the Eurasian Technology University in Kazakhstan. Dilfuza Krulova, human rights lawyer and founding curator of the Global Shapers Tashkent Hub, which is the youth-led initiative. She's joining us from Uzbekistan. Alia Suranova is with us. She's a Bishkek-based journalist. And Bruce Pannier, the editor of Ready for Europe, Ready Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today. So I'm kind of inclined to start the conversation with the latest news that came out today from Kyrgyzstan. I guess things might change by the day the podcast will go online, which is Sunday, but it's unlikely that the guy will go back to jail. So Alia, maybe we can start with you. It is so painful to watch this guy holding stick and repeatedly beating his wife. Perhaps you have seen that clip too. Please tell us about this horrible scene and the background of the story.
Do you mean the story where the husband hung 2 tires on his wife's neck and he poured cold water over her, or is it a different case? I'm sorry.
I haven't heard about that case. Okay, let's start with the one.
Yeah, we have a lot of cases like that, unfortunately.
He was filmed. He was on the video.
Yeah.
He was beating his son, and then he beat his wife too.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Maybe a couple months ago.
Okay.
Yeah, the tire one we want to get at also.
Okay, I saw that news coming out today. Oh, perhaps the news is because the guy was released today. So yeah, okay. So we have 2 stories to start with. Maybe Bruce, would you like to talk about that video, and then we will get the other account Alia was referring to.
Yeah, well, Alia will know more about everything that's been happening there. No, this person was filmed beating his son, and his frustrated. She was the one that was filming it and asking him to stop. And then so the video went out on social networks. They ended up catching the guy, and it turned out that he had beat his wife also. Really badly. And so that was what he was finally sentenced today. But it was a 2-year suspended sentence, so he's not going to do any jail time. I mean, he was detained for a while, but he's done, and he's back with the family. Even though this video showed him, going on for a couple minutes, slapping his son around, 9-10-year-old son. I can't remember how old he was, but yeah, certainly the incident with the poor woman that had the tires hung around her with bricks in them and had cold water poured on her was really horrific and provoked a lot of reaction.
Let's have Alia's account in that. Alia, yeah, please continue.
Yeah, unfortunately, since the beginning of this year, we have been witnessing a lot of cases where husbands performed a lot of violence on their wives, especially since January and during the quarantine time when the families had to be locked together in the same houses and apartments. We have witnessed a raise in cases of domestic violence by up to 65% during the time of the quarantine compared to the same time period of the last year, for example. So we have seen several very blood-stopping cases since the beginning of the year, especially in the Issyk region. The year started with the husband burning his wife after he poured gasoline on her, and also the case that you were talking about, where the father first he beat up his son and made his wife apparently recorded on her telephone, and then we found out that he had been released after this. And we also saw a lot of cases. Some of the friends who stood up for them, and they were filming these 2 people, the husband and the wife, where they were just standing and saying, well, we were just this is how we raise our children. Doesn't anyone beat up their children on and off? Don't you do the same thing? They were just angry, and everybody has to understand and forgive them. So in a lot of cases, unfortunately, when we see that domestic violence takes place, in a lot of cases, we see that unfortunately, in the end, the abuser, the person who commits the crime, the violence, they get away with this. Just like with this case, where, as Bruce previously mentioned, he got away with the suspended probation.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's a mental issue. So, what is this all cruelty about in punishing our wives? Is this a familiar story in any of other countries in the region? Khalida, you are joining us from Kazakhstan, and Dilfuza from Uzbekistan. Yeah, just feel free to grab the microphone and talk about this issue. And did any part of this conversation sounded familiar to the situation in your countries?
Yes, thank you. Yes, if I may add a little bit. Khalida from Kazakhstan.
Right.
Indeed, I would like to agree that unfortunately during the lockdown in Kazakhstan, which lasted from March till mid of May, we also saw an increase in the number of domestic violence. For example, the number of domestic assaults and beatings that happened in houses, in households, it increased by 25% compared to the previous year, to the same period. And unfortunately, we also saw a significant rise in murders that that happened in households as the result of domestic violence. And this increase was by 34%. And we do see this problem when, because of the lockdown, many shelters for abused victims, they were shut down, and the abused women and children, they had no place to go, and more such horrific news about such tragedies as violent treatment of children, beatings, and murder of partners, intimate partners. They indeed were appearing every day on social media, in the news, and of course this is quite appalling. For example, one of the shocking news we had was when one man in western Kazakhstan, he apparently murdered his wife and two of his little daughters, aged 6 and 8 years old. And in order to cover up his crimes, he burnt down the house.
Wow.
Allegedly claiming, that the house kind of burned by itself. But unfortunately, when the bodies of the woman and her daughters were found, they were all, located in such positions that, for example, a little girl, she was apparently hiding away from her father. And this was really a huge tragedy. And we do get a lot of, I would say, discussions and the outbreak of, demands to call for increasing or strengthening the punishment for domestic violence in Kazakhstan. Right. But unfortunately, at the moment, we are still in the process of increasing the punishment for such crimes in our country.
Dilfuza, anything to add into this conversation?
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, I'm very at the same line with my colleagues that mentioned from stories from neighboring countries. The biggest scandal that has happened recently, maybe you have heard and seen in Facebook, that a lady, she was 17 years old. She was constantly had intimate relations with a married man with 2 children or 3 children. And then the society and family decided that he has to do something with that. And in order not to go to the court and scandal and social pressure, they decided to get married. So he said, okay, I'm so gentleman, so get me her as a second wife. And they went to Mullah, they read this nikah, and when she became the second wife. Of course, it's not legal. And then after a couple of days or months, she turned 18 years old. And after her birthday, after a few days, she committed a suicide. And this is now the court and then prosecutor general office is reviewing the case, and it revealed that her body was found and she was killed a few days ago before the people have found her death. So people in society and Facebook and Twitter and media, they think that of course she was abused, she was raped, she had domestic violence, and maybe because she could not find any solution, any support from the family, from the society, and she decided to commit suicide. And it's not the first case. For example, a couple of weeks ago, also there was a case when the girl was beaten up in the street because she wore short shorts. So it was too short for the society, and the guy came and beat her up. So these kind of situations are happening. Domestic violence is, I think, increasing because of this COVID as well.
An equally horrible terrible is the response by the authorities, I guess, like in the case of what just happened in Kyrgyzstan and the other cases that you have been talking about, Khalida and Dilfuza, in Kyrgyzstan, this man, with documented evidence of torture, he just gets released. How would you interpret the response by the authorities, Alia?
Yeah, if I also may add, recently also a 13-year-old girl, she was raped by a grown-up man in one of the trade centers in Bishkek. And recently the man was, set free by the judge, and it also stirred a lot of discussions in social media as well, because everybody was horrified by this fact that there was evidence that this girl was raped in one of the restrooms of the trade center, and given all of the evidence, the judge just let the raper he let him free. And these cases, when we see when the murderers, the men who commit these crimes, the rapers, when they are asked what caused them to do it, like what their motives were, their answers are very shocking. For example, some of them say because she was late for 2 hours, after visiting her relatives, or some of them said she didn't cook properly. Another person says, I didn't like the way she, moves around the house. She was too slow. So we see that some of the activists interpret it as femicide. And also when we see that there's this absolute indifference by the authorities, and especially when we see that a lot of cases of domestic violence, they get neglected and ignored by the local police officers because there's no such thing as empathy. And a lot of police officers who happen to be males, they also, are in solidarity with those men who commit these crimes, toward these women, because they also, stick to these patriarchal, I don't know how else to describe these ways of thinking. And unfortunately, what's happening in our politics and government, in the decision-making layers, is that everybody's concerned with the upcoming parliament events. And there's a lot of other things that are happening, like people are struggling for power, and they're just playing this big politics, while a lot of women are falling victims of domestic violence and everyday, crimes committed by their husbands, their partners, their brothers and fathers. We see that they don't put it as a priority. They just think that there are much more important things than that.
Very interesting.
And it's very upsetting.
Yeah, it is. It is very upsetting. And while you were talking, Alia, let me also take Bruce's point in this. I was just wondering about the video that I was referring to earlier in Kyrgyzstan. It's such a useful that this video got public. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know what happened. But in many cases, such tortures also unreported, right?
Yes, we believe that in many cases, some women's rights activists say that around 1 in only 10 women go to, end up going to the police station and reporting the, case of domestic violence. Most of the times, it's also a lot of pressure from their relatives, their neighbors, their communities. They call it like the local mentality, or they say this isn't in our mentality, this isn't our culture. You should obey your husband. You should be an obedient wife. You should listen to what he's saying. You should not let him, do this to yourself because probably your tongue is too long, or your temper is not, soft enough. So in a lot of the cases, women get ashamed for becoming a victim of domestic violence. A lot of times people turn against them, especially when we see in the case with the woman who was beaten up by her husband, with 2 tires hanging down her neck. Also, piled with bricks. Then several days after he was detained, she asked the authorities to release him. She said, I am forgiving him. But we're also seeing that this is not what she is willing to do, or, it's not about her forgiving him. It's about the pressure that she's feeling from her relatives, from his relatives. It's also the things that she was brought up with. It's rooted deep in her head most of the times. So most of the times, unfortunately, when women don't receive any support from their family members, from their communities, from local authorities, and when they receive no protection and no support from the police and the law enforcement agencies, institutions, that's when the tragedy keeps rolling, and we will never see the end until everybody starts standing up for women who become the victims.
Yeah. On the reporting, though, maybe let me bring in Dilfuza, you here. One reason why women continue to avoid reporting is also attached to sort of a social stigma of complaining about your husband or the family members, as the Alia was talking about. Talk about a little bit about the social pressure against women who wants to come forward and report about it.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing that is also common in Uzbekistan. Mostly women, you know that we have a mahalla committees, right? So it's an institution that deal with the family affairs. And before this February 2020, Uzbekistan had a women committee of Uzbekistan who was also dealing with different women and family issues. Also, we had another institution called Mahalla Committee and Mahalla Foundation. Then on February 2020, the government decided to make it one institution, and they dissolved these three institutions actually. Women Committee, Mahalla Foundation, and Nurani Foundation. Nurani is for elderly people. And then they created a Ministry of Mahalla and Family Affairs. So their primarily mandate is to deal with these family issues that is happening. But in reality, we see that people who are working in Mahalla committees, they are usually coming to the families, for example, if they have a scandal or whatever, and say, hey, look, why would you stay as a divorced woman, and where would you go if you're not, for example, earning, you have 2 children, and people will be pointing you will be black point in your family, and they will be doing every single thing just to preserve this family. And just preserve his family, it's not the mental health of the family. It's not about, taking care of the family and dealing and tackling the problem. But in contrarily, we see many families, many children at the end ending up in closed institutions because they want to commit a crime since this mental health problems and pressure. And then we also see women who are committing crimes or they're ending up with a suicide. I myself provide for almost a year free legal consultations to women through, not only women, but through the social media. And I would say half of the women who are actually writing me, they are victims of the domestic violence, or they don't want how to divorce because they do afraid, not because they will be beaten up, but because of this social stigma, and say, how would I survive in a society where they do not accept her as a single person?
On that, Khalida, despite all these pressures that Alia and Dilfouza mentioned, if one decides to report, are there sufficient mechanism or system in place to hear such complaints and do something about it? Let's start with your own country.
Indeed, in Kazakhstan, we do have all the laws in place that provide for punishment for domestic violence. And I would like to note that, for example, in 2017, 2 of the types of domestic violence, such as beating and causing light harm to health, they used to be in the criminal code. And for that reason, there was an issue of underreporting, because according to our police and some NGOs, women, they didn't want to report on their husbands because they didn't want their husbands to be called like criminals or be stigmatized for committing this crime. So for this reason, in 2017, our parliament decriminalized domestic violence and moved these 2 types of domestic violence into administrative code. And now, according to the administrative code, the police has to react to any information and any report about domestic violence. And it doesn't matter who reports domestic violence, whether this is a victim of abuse or a neighbor, a relative. They have to go and see what's happening in the household. And according to law, when the police officers come and they do see the signs of committed domestic violence, they have to initiate administrative proceedings and send the materials of the case to court.
But do they do it as the law dictates?
Yes. Thank you for raising this issue, because this is all according to law. But what we see is that the police officers who come to the scene, quite often they do not issue, a protocol, and they do not report, and they do not prepare all the materials and send them to court. So unfortunately, here we have a problem of diligent police officers, prudent police officers, and those who do not really want, to do anything about it. Maybe because they are in agreement with an abuser, maybe they believe that this is a private matter, a family matter, or they believe that it is the victim's fault. And unfortunately, we do have such an opinion among some police officers that domestic violence is just a conflict between a wife and a husband, and it is their own private matter. And of course, this is something that we as human rights lawyers, as researchers and NGO activists, we are trying to fight against, and we regularly hold roundtable discussions, and we send letters to police, indicating all these gaps in implementation of the law.
Right. Bruce, let me bring you in here. These painful stories are very much similar throughout the region. The way it happened and the way things develop after an incident happens. And also, it's also true throughout the region that you get the feeling like these bodies, these security agencies and bodies who are responsible to take action about these abuses, they are almost apologetic about what happened. Like either they think this is not urgent, or maybe these things are okay in the society. I mean, what's the source of this behavior? I mean, there are laws passed in the parliament and there are orders in place that they have to take action, but it's not happening. So what's the source of this problem?
If you talk to some people, then, and I'm sure this is what a lot of these women hear too, is this is just the way it is, right? There's conflicts and fights within families, and it's really unfortunate that this happens, but it does happen. And of course, as we've heard, then they give you that thing of like the family is more important than this. Than anything else. So do whatever you have to do. Take whatever punishment you take. But, you're making this sacrifice for the family. And unfortunately, and also we've also heard, the laws are really strange on this. The police, in some cases, I've heard this in the past, the police will show up and just like the Mahala Committee that we heard about, they will tell women that have been beaten that maybe it's better off if they just let this go and don't pursue a court case against their husband, right? Now, even if they do, right, and they have a complaint, the number, just this year, I was looking at some of the stories from Kyrgyzstan, the woman that we heard that was burned by her husband, he poured gasoline on her and burned her. She withdrew the complaint. The woman who had the tires hung on her and cold water poured on her and was beaten in the face on video withdrew the complaint against her husband. And a lot of times that's enough. When the wife says she's under social pressure, the police don't seem too interested, the court system doesn't seem very interested. And when they withdraw the complaint, it just kind of like vanishes. And, what they need, and I know what Kyrgyzstan has been trying to work for, is that an assault is an assault.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if the person that was beaten wants to withdraw the complaint or not. The fact is it was an assault. And this is really how you have to come at this. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, and also, I was just researching this topic today, and I came across with a video. I don't know whether this video was captured today, and this is coming from the Kyrgyz parliament, where a female member of parliament brings some sort of bill which talks about the women's rights, and then also raises some questions about the previous case of torture. And this just parliament goes silent. Nobody wants to say anything about that in support of the motion. Nobody wants to respond. Have you seen this video, Bruce?
I have not, personally.
This was so strange environment there in the Kyrgyz parliament.
Like I said, I'm not surprised. This is one of those taboo subjects. Everyone knows it goes on, and very few people want to do anything about it. And every time there's some woman dies or is crippled, horribly, beaten or something like that, there's an outcry for a little while, and then it kind of dies down. And you remember we did a show on women's rights right after the March 8th march in Bishkek. Yeah. And you remember the reaction that it got, where a lot of people came out that got broken up. The only ones seen were the women that were marching, masked men came running onto the square. But still, and all right, the coronavirus is going on, but that's forgotten in it's only been, not even 4 months, and no one knows about that already.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this fear factor a little bit later. But now about the social stigma. So how challenging does it get? For example, once on one hand, you have some horrible husbands, not only husband, in some cases, like other family members abusing women. On the other hand, the victim is not willing to come forward. How challenging does this make the problem? Also, on the top of that, dysfunctional legal system that fails again and again to intervene. Where does this leave efforts to resolve this crisis? Let's continue the debate talking about these and many other questions from the perspective of NGOs. first, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Khalida Ashigulova, the Director of the Research Center for Human Rights, Inclusion in Civil Society. Also, Khalida is an Associate Professor at the Eurasian Technology University in Kazakhstan. Dilfuza Krulova, Human Rights Lawyer and Founding Curator of the Global Shapers Tashkent Hub, which is a youth-led initiative. She's joining us from Uzbekistan. Alia Suranova, Bishkek-based journalist. Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog. Kishlok Owazi. Bruce is joining us from Prague, Europe. I'm Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing women's rights in Central Asia in efforts to achieve gender equality. Okay, I think, I kind of forgot to touch, a number of you have raised this issue, the coronavirus impact. The things has been already challenging in Central Asia, and on the top of that, you have lockdown. So news reaches to us that urgent calls by women who are complaining about torture have significantly increased in recent years. Dilfuza, any stats you might have from your country in terms of the spike of those calls to the authorities or the NGOs, or maybe you yourself as a lawyer, that you are getting from victims?
Unfortunately, we don't have such statistic data. It's very difficult to get any statistics, but regarding the women in during the coronavirus, it was not released yet. But I know that since last year, in Uzbekistan, 2 important laws on women protection was adopted in September 2. One is on gender equality of men and women, and the second is law on protection of women from violence and oppression. I think it's a very important step. And then back in that time, Women Committee, they also opened the shelters and they started accepting the calls. And I remember there was some amount like thousands of calls during a couple of weeks. But it was the statistics by the end of the year, not the coronavirus. So on the statistic data, I don't have, but I know that there was an NGO group who immediately started receiving the calls. So we do have shelters, independent shelters throughout the country, and they started providing actually psychological support to women because, there was a very hard lockdown in Uzbekistan. No one could go out or move around the city in all parts of the Uzbekistan. So they started telling the phone numbers and victims could call them in very private way and safe way. Also, I remember that in maybe March or April, the UNDP and the Senate, they also started distributing leaflets through Apteka, the drugstores, because there was one of the places where women actually can go or any person can go during the quarantine. It was not limited, so you could go there easily. And they thought it will be the first and primarily space and safe place to women get the information how to call and say about their business. But again, since it was almost impossible to get the security warranty, as my colleague before mentioned in Kazakhstan, and the legal remedies were not available during the quarantine, even if the woman could call, they could not receive any assistance apart from psychological assistance. Of course, psychological assistance is important, but when you're living 24 hours in one space with your abuser, sometimes it will not work out or help.
Yeah, that's a very important element. Khalida, I assume this is a kind of region-wide phenomenon. Any news, any status from your side, from your country?
From our side, I would like to mention that luckily we do get all the official statistics from the Ministry of Interior. They do inform us. So actually, I'm quite happy that we have this efficient dialogue with our authorities. And according to the statistics, during the first 4 months of this year, which of course includes the time of pandemic and lockdown, we had 46,000 of calls to police about domestic violence. And this is, as I earlier mentioned, is an increase in 25% compared to the previous year or in the same period. But the problem is that among these 46,000 reports of domestic violence, only 8,000 cases reached the court. So they reached the administrative court. And among these 8,000 cases, 4,000 victims, they actually reconciled with their abusers in court. And we, of course, send this question to our police because, as I earlier mentioned, according to our current legislation, all incidents, all reports about domestic violence, they should be registered and administrative proceedings should be initiated immediately and the case should be sent to court within 3 days. However, we see that if there are only 8,000 cases that reach the court, it actually may indicate that the police officers may not be doing their work properly. You know, they may not be registering every case. And this is, of course, very sad and disappointing that many abusers, they just go without any punishment, even let it be administrative punishment.
Right. Aliyah, just in 2 words, is there any numbers that you would like to present us in terms of the spike of these cases during the coronavirus-related lockdowns in Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, during the lockdown, the women's rights activists reported that there has been an increase by 65% of stated cases of domestic violence compared to the same period of last year. It also included domestic violence towards not only the women, but also children. We have also witnessed very sad several cases of suicide among teenagers who also had to, spend all of the time at home with their parents. There was a very intensive atmosphere. And it also, during the quarantine, the activists actually, they managed to promote this new policy on domestic violence where the offender had to be taken to the police station for at least 48 hours after being reported for abuse. Before that, we didn't have that thing, and the victim had to stay with her abuser in the same space. But with the quarantine, they managed to do it, and thanks to our parliament, who not always make rational decisions. This was a very good step towards, helping women who were locked with their abusers in the same house and apartments. As soon as they reported domestic violence, the men would be taken to the police station and be kept there for at least 48 hours. This is just a temporary measure to give the victim some time to, find another place to go, go to her parents or maybe find a shelter or, find somebody who would defend her, so that at least in 48 hours she and her kids would be in peace and have time to do something against about that situation.
We are talking about mostly Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan because we have speakers from there joining us in the discussion. We were hoping to have someone from Tajikistan, and the last minute she decided not to join us. It's also kind of awkward situation that in most of our podcasts in which we look at the regional issues, we cannot get views from Turkmenistan because their situation is as such that we don't even find anyone relevant to speak about anything. And yet situation is far more worse than any other Central Asian country in Turkmenistan. I just wanted to note that for the record. It's one thing to make a female colleague of yours a Speaker of the Parliament, reverse the Parliament, but it's entirely something different to give them a real power, treat them as an equal partner in decision making, and none of that exists in Turkmenistan, unfortunately. Bruce, let me bring you in here with this note. Aliyah was kind of referring to a very interesting point here about the need for change on behalf of the authorities to deal with this situation. Earlier in the example of this video, when women's rights related issue is raised in the parliament, either to pass a bill or maybe just questions was raised in front of the security officials, and specifically in this video, that was the case. There were a couple of security officials with stars on their shoulder sitting. Their purpose there was to answer questions, and when this question was raised, they were just looking at each other. So why they are not confident to take action against these things? Is there anything to be feared about? Is there anything that we are not seeing that which stops them taking action? What's behind their inaction?
Well, that's a good question, and I wish I had a really good answer for that. I mean, I guess there is no real good answer for that. Again, I think the unfortunate problem that a lot of people look at this as a social problem, but one that you're not going to stop, and some have become so accustomed to this being part of the routine of life that they don't want to take the step of saying, enough is enough, and we can't let this go on anymore, because they're hearing from people around them that let them work it out. It's not your business. They'll figure it out themselves. And like I said earlier, that shouldn't be the way it is. I mean, especially law enforcement.
Bruce,
there should be a whole.
Yeah, Bruce. What I had in mind is, like, for example, are they afraid of being villainized by someone if they take a stand on this issue? I mean, in case of Kyrgyzstan, one group comes to mind is like, what's that, Kyrgyzchuro type of people who might do something bad against people who stand in support of such a just case, for example, defending women's rights. I mean, is there any element like that playing behind the scene here?
Well, again, like I said, it's part of society. A group like that, would say, why are you interfering with this? I couldn't give you a good answer for this at all. I think that unfortunately a lot of these people have become accustomed to this as just being the way it is, and there's enough people in society that will tell them that's just the way it is. Is what it is.
When pictures like that played on TV, for example, if I were to be a person living in somewhere in Kyrgyzstan or any other Central Asian country, I would be afraid of going to the authorities, complaining about one of my family members, and because it just clearly shows that they are not really in a position to take action. So, but one organization that is active in this field is on the society level is NGOs. Let's take a NGO perspective on this. So, what the NGOs are doing. Who wants to take a question? Maybe Khalida, you are an NGO person, and also Dilfuza, you are active in this field. Any specific steps that you guys have taken and that had any positive impact towards the resolution of this issue?
Yes, thank you. If I may start with Kazakhstan, I would like to note that though I position myself as a researcher, more as a researcher, I do support local NGOs who promote the rights of victims of domestic violence, of sexual violence. And for example, in Kazakhstan, we have a very prominent NGO called Nemalchi, which is translated from Russian into English as "Don't Be Silent." And this NGO, it has really made a lot of difference into changing the mentality of our people when they read or hear about incidents of domestic violence. And also this NGO has been active in changing the legislation, in calling for reforms of the legislation, and their calls, because they have been written in such a powerful way, they were really heard, by the authorities. And my role here is to support this NGO and other NGOs as a lawyer, because I'm also a professional lawyer, and many of these NGOs they lack this legal support. So, and of course, on my side, I support these NGOs. For example, on social media, I repost their posts about violence, about their calls for the change, and they add scientifically justified, findings which also support the changes of the law. And I would like to note, for example, this NGO, Nemalchi, KZ, what they managed to do is that because of their statistics, because of their continuous reporting and covering all these horrific incidents of domestic violence, we managed to collect a very substantial evidence base. And then we sent it to members of parliament, to other governmental officials, and we managed to initiate the reform of our current law on prevention of domestic violence. I would like to note that, for example, in Kazakhstan, we were the first country in the Central Asian region who adopted a law on prevention of domestic violence back in 2009. And now we are devising and hoping to adopt by the end of this year a new law which would not be dealing only with prevention of domestic violence, but which aims at counteraction of domestic violence, which means that we are aiming to adopt measures that would be changing the mentality of our people, that would be really promoting the zero tolerance to any form of violence in our country, among our population.
These are very good steps. I mean, these adaptation of new laws, but what is important is whether they are implemented in practice. In terms of the NGOs or any individual action that might have made a difference in your country, Dilfuza, what comes to your mind?
Thank you so much. But actually, we also have this Nemalchi.uz. I think it has been done in collaboration with Kazakh Nemalchi KZ. We do have very good femme activists. And I think without their help and without their efforts, we would never accept these two laws last year. And moreover, not only adopting these two laws, but also to create under the Senate a special, government body body which is overseeing what is going on in this sphere. So NGOs are working. I know that, for example, this after 2005 event in Uzbekistan, right, most of the NGOs were closed or they had to go under re-registration. However, starting from 2000s and 1990s, many shelters are still functioning. Maybe they are not so active, but they do function and they're very local based. However, recent maybe 3-4 years, these femme activists and Nimalchi Uz, it's a movement. It's not an NGO because it's not registered. It's very difficult in Uzbekistan to register the NGO. So this movement is very successful, and people are on Facebook. They have an official page on Facebook. They are following them. They are supporting them. Always when the meetings are happening, Nimalchi Uz is always cited and always referred to. And I think the author, who is Irina Matvienko, she's doing a huge work on that. And then many people who are following her, they just got inspired how this young lady with her big team or not big, they're moving forward. And then people are listening, and governments are also listening to them. And they are also trying to be accountable on these sectors because, we do have a few female members of the parliament, then we have in the government, and through them, I think it was possible to make some changes in the country.
Yeah, we were hoping to have Irina Matvienko in this discussion, but she was so humble, saying that her English is not sufficient. Perhaps we will try to get her in some of our future discussion. Alia,
maybe next time we can do together. I can help her in the translations.
Definitely, that would be lovely. Alia, Kyrgyzstan is full of NGOs, right? Is there any NGO that you would like to give shout out in terms of their performance in making a difference in this situation?
Yeah, we have a lot of NGOs, and we also have some movements who also do a lot of work in terms of women's rights. One of them is the Association of Crisis Centers in Kyrgyzstan. So they work with all the crisis centers that exist in our country, and they bring their work together. They did a lot of job, especially during the quarantine, and they also try to lobby and promote a lot of laws and policies to improve the situation with women's rights in our country. And also there has been this movement called Unite. They have done information campaign on how to act and what to do if you're locked with an abuser during the quarantine period. And we also have this organization, the Bishkek Feminist Initiative, who those brave girls who went out to this march on the 8th of March, who have been assaulted and attacked by these unknown men in masks. And later these men were not even detained, and the girls were found guilty of this whole situation. So these female organizations and female rights activists that I listed, they have been doing a lot of important things, for women's lives and for girls' rights in our country. And I would really like to thank them.
Anyone helping them? Who are helping them?
Well, mostly they are supported by different donors, international donors and NGOs, as we already mentioned. Some of them also collaborate with some government officials. Sometimes, they have some allies in the state structures, but mostly they are functioning and doing a lot of things, mostly thanks to the support by the NGOs.
Okay. Both Dilfuza and Khalida, so what kind of help does those NGOs need to make a difference? Is there anything particular that would help them a lot?
In Kazakhstan, I would say that, for example, this particular NGO that I've been referring to, Nimalchi, Das KZ, a big concern is that we don't have a transparent process of allocating governmental funding, to NGOs. So we do have problem with non-transparency and kind of maybe like interference of the government, to which NGOs to give funding. And what is remarkable with this NGO is that without any support from the government, without any support from international donors, it was fully funded by the public. So we, the public, the members of the public who have been reading their posts, we were donating the money to their fund, to support them. And this is really remarkable what type of work they have managed to achieve. So apart from initiating these changes to legislation, they managed also to provide sufficient support to the victims of abuse, of sexual violence. They managed to help them find justice in court. And so now I would say that the support that they need is, of course, the support in changing the laws and also implementing the laws properly. And now we are promoting these changes. And of course, we understand that even if there will be tougher punishment for abusers, domestic abusers, it would not change the situation if the mentality of police officers would not change, if their procedures, how they investigate the cases of domestic violence would not change. So here, I would say there would be more understanding on the part of our law enforcement agencies that they need to change in the first place, that they need to show more empathy, and they should not be judging, they should not be judgmental towards the victims of abuse, but they should really show this equality, and equal treatment to every person who reports about crime to them. Then, of course, this would really help. Would really help to bring justice to this in these cases, and would really help decrease the number the number of domestic violence and violence in general in our society.
Right. Thank you very much, Khalida. Very quickly from you, Dilfuza, we also need to be wrapping up the discussion soon on this.
Yeah.
And what kind of support would make a difference for the NGOs who are working on this?
Apart from what Alia already mentioned, the same is happening in Uzbekistan. So apart from the funding sources, we also, I think, what is needed is solidarity and a huge inter-support between the NGOs. Because what we have seen, the civil society has been not so active for years. Now it's activating. However, it's in the stage when people are not sure, do they want to do NGO sector work or maybe not to deal with this because it's very politicized. So it's very tricky on that. And also there should be constant trainings of the police officers that are dealing with the domestic violence, and maybe more stricter laws on domestic violence. So I would say even criminalization of this offense, because now it's not criminal yet. So the criminalization is needed.
Okay. Very final thoughts from Bruce. What would it take to change the situation, the challenges that we've been talking about today? And with that, we will end the conversation here.
I mean, you just need to change the mentality. The days of living in remote areas and family violence and stuff, it's really we're talking about half your population are going to be women, and you're raising future generations, and they should be seeing this. They shouldn't be subjected to it. You really need to change the mentality entirely and realize that, like I said, this is just unacceptable behavior. You get nothing from this. In fact, all it does is cause problems, and it needs to be stopped.
Speaking of, support, in our part, we are here to provide a platform so that you guys can speak to the authorities who can do something about that. You are always welcome, colleagues. But unfortunately, with this, we have to conclude the discussion here for today. But our eyes will remain wide open, and we will remain in touch with each of you to continue the conversation. Thank you very much for your courageous work. Thank you for doing what you are doing. And thank you for coming forward and sharing your thoughts. And thank you for your time. Dr. Khalida Ajigulova, the Director of the Research Center for Human Rights Inclusion in Civil Society from Kazakhstan. Dilfuza Krulova, human rights lawyer and founding curator of the Global Shapers Tashkent Hub. She was joining us from Uzbekistan. Alia Suranova, Bishkek-based journalist, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, and best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And this is it from me, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week. Bye-bye.